Okay, so we want to make sure that air is going into the engine at the right time and exhaust is leaving the engine at the right time. You wouldn't want a valve opening in the middle of a combustion stroke. So, in order to synchronize the timing of the valves to match the timing of the pistons, we can just synchronize the rotation of the camshaft with the rotation of the crankshaft. So to do that, we need a few gears and a timing belt. A cam gear is mounted to the end of the camshaft to time the cams, and a crankshaft gear is mounted to the end of the crankshaft to drive the camshaft. But the timing belt doesn't just turn the cam gear. It also powers the water pump, which is responsible for sending coolant throughout the engine block to prevent it from overheating. And we're going to come back to cooling in just a minute. But first, we need to keep tension in the timing belt using a timing belt tensioner. And the way we link our cam gear, our crankshaft gear, and our water pump gear together so that everything is in time is by using a timing belt. Now, to prevent any dust or other things, debris getting into those planes, we need a timing belt cover. And then on top of our precious valve assembly is protected by a valve cover. Now that the valves controlling our air intake and exhaust are in time and the motion of the pistons is in time, we need to ensure that the combustions happen in time as well. So like we mentioned earlier, each combustion is set off by a spark plug. Now unfortunately, the 12 volts from a car battery isn't sufficient for a spark plug to create an arc. So an ignition coil uses induction to increase the voltage from 12 volts to something like 40,000 volts. In our case, the ignition coil is found inside a distributor, which makes sure each spark plug fires at the correct time via the rotor. The end of the rotor receives electrical current from the ignition coil. So as the camshaft spins, the rotor spins, and it comes in and out of contact with 4 terminals in the distributor cap. As it touches those terminals, an electric current is sent to a corresponding spark plug via a spark plug wire. And that is what sparks and ignites our air-fuel mixture to create combustion. Now with all those sparks going off thousands of times a minute, we need to keep the battery charged with an alternator. Now the alternator is held in place by an alternator bracket and an alternator tensioner. Inside the alternator, that is where all the magic is happening. An electric current is induced by spinning an electromagnet. That electromagnet is spun by the alternator pulley. Now driving that pulley is a harmonic balancer. Sometimes this would just be a crankshaft pulley, but our pulley is integrated into the balancer, which helps dampen vibrations in that rotating assembly. And the way we get the alternator pulley spinning is by means of an alternator belt. Now, with all those little explosions going off every second, engines, they can get hot, like really hot. And since the crankshaft is always spinning, the water pump will always be spinning as well. But sometimes, like in cold weather, you actually want the engine to warm up a bit. So this coolant pipe exiting the pump leads to a thermostat housing, which houses the thermostat. So the thermostat is technically a valve that slowly opens and closes depending on the coolant's temperature. When the coolant's cold, the thermostat closes and the coolant is redirected back to the engine to keep warming up. As the coolant heats up, the thermostat opens, directing the coolant out of coolant hoses, making its way to the front of the car where it enters the radiator. And attached to the radiator is a cooling fan which helps dissipate the heat into the air before the coolant returns back to the engine. Now throughout this process, as coolant heats up, it expands. So the radiator cap allows that expansion to happen at a set pressure. As the pressure gets too much, the spring in the cap compresses where coolant will flow over into the coolant reservoir. Now for an engine to run properly, the ratio of air to fuel in combustion chamber is absolutely critical. So we need to control the airflow going into the engine's intake ports right here. Now starting from outside the car, air goes through the air filter, which is in the air filter housing. Now this gets rid of any major contaminants before going through the air intake pipe and past the throttle body. Now the throttle body houses a butterfly valve that is controlled by the gas pedal, and it determines how much air gets into the engine. The more air, the more fuel, the faster you can go.